Imagine walking into a casino, and you put $50 million on a single spin of the roulette wheel.
Okay, that's a lot of money.
Right. And the dealer looks at you and says, the wheel won't actually stop spinning for another 5 years.
Oh, man.
Yeah, that is essentially what corporate executives do, like every single day when they authorize these major investments. I mean, we look at corporate spreadsheets and we just expect this engineering level precision.
Right. You see a projected profit on the bottom line,
Yeah.
and you just assume that's a guarantee.
Exactly.
It creates this really wonderful illusion of certainty. We love numbers because they fit neatly into columns and rows. It just feels concrete.
It does. But the reality is, when you step into the world of corporate financial forecasting, that spreadsheet is just full of ghosts.
Yeah.
We are looking at a landscape of high-stakes gambling that is completely murky. And that is our mission for this deep dive today. We're looking at the foundational concepts of return on investment, right, ROI. Our goal is to demystify the intense, high-stakes math that major corporations use to make massive financial decisions. We are going to decode how companies look into the future, how they weigh risk, and ultimately decide whether to spend millions of dollars.
And what's fascinating here is that while we are going to talk about financial formulas, things like discounted cash flow and hurdle rates, the underlying reality isn't really about math at all.
Yeah.
It's a story about human psychology,
Right.
the sheer terror of uncertainty, and ultimately corporate survival in a completely unpredictable world.
Right. So before we get into the heavy math of how they calculate this stuff, I think we have to understand why companies obsess over these long-term forecasts. Because a business makes hundreds of financial decisions every week. Like, why is evaluating a major investment any different from just day-to-day operations?
We have to draw a very hard line between two distinct types of choices. You have operating decisions and capital expenditures. Operating decisions are your day-to-day adjustments. Think about scheduling overtime for your staff to meet a rush order, or maybe buying a little extra raw material because you anticipate a busy month.
So stuff that is easily reversible.
Exactly.
Like if the rush order gets canceled, you just cancel the overtime next week?
Correct. The financial penalty for making a mistake on an operating decision is minimal. You can pivot.
Right.
But a capital expenditure, or CapEx, is an entirely different beast. We are talking about buying heavy, specialized machinery or building a massive manufacturing plant in a new country.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, these involve a massive outlay of cash up front, and the financial commitment locks you in for years, if not decades.
I like to think of operating decisions like renting an Airbnb for a weekend. If you show up and the neighborhood is terrible or your plans change, you just cancel.
Yeah, you lose a little bit of money, maybe.
Right. You might lose a small deposit, but you move on. But a capital expenditure is like buying a house with all cash, no inspection, and you aren't allowed to sell it for 10 years.
Right.
It is irreversible and, frankly, terrifying.
That analogy hits the nail on the head, because once you pour concrete and install that custom machinery, you are trapped. If customer preferences suddenly shift, or if a new competitor enters the market, you can't just undo the factory.
You just have millions of dollars of idle equipment sitting there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just consumer whims that threaten these investments. Companies have to evaluate severe systemic risks. Things like a certain depletion of critical raw materials, or a major railroad shutting down the only transportation line out of your facility.
Oh, man, yeah.
Or even a sudden massive shortage of skilled labor in that specific region.
And that is just the physical stuff. I mean, the sheer uncertainty of technological disruption makes this even wilder.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about what happened to independent booksellers and eventually massive chains like Barnes & Noble when Amazon figured out the logistics of online book delivery.
Right.
Or think about Newsweek magazine. I mean, that used to be a physical staple in literally every dentist's waiting room in the country.
It really was.
And then, seemingly overnight, the print edition completely disappeared and they had to scramble to become a website-only operation.
Yeah. Those examples highlight how quickly the ground can shift. Because if you are Barnes & Noble and you just tied up all your cash in a 10-year capital expenditure to build 20 massive new brick-and-mortar stores and then the e-reader is invented,
Oh my gosh.
your company's actual existence is in jeopardy. And because the stakes are that existential, banks and external lenders become incredibly paranoid. They won't lend a dime for a capital expenditure unless they are convinced by a thoroughly researched, bulletproof forecast.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the stakes are so irreversibly high, companies need a concrete mathematical way to measure the future value of a deal.
Yes.
They cannot just go to a bank and say, hey, we have a really good feeling about this factory.
No, the bank will laugh you out of the room.
Right, they need a system. Which leads us to the absolute core concept of corporate finance, which is discounted cash flow.
Yes, DCF. And to understand discounted cash flow, you first have to internalize a foundational principle, which is the time value of money.
Okay.
Simply put, a dollar handed to you today is inherently worth more than a dollar handed to you a year from now.
Because of inflation, right? Like things will just cost more next year.
Well, inflation is part of it, yes, but there's a bigger mechanic at play, which is opportunity. If I give you $1 million today, you can immediately invest it, you can put it in a safe bond, or use it to expand your business, and it will generate more money over the next 12 months.
Right.
If I make you wait a year to get that $1 million, I have robbed you of 12 months of wealth-generating opportunity.
Which brings up a really interesting semantic point about how we view returns. A lot of people separate buying stocks from banking, but structurally, profit and interest are conceptually the exact same thing.
They really are.
Like, if I buy a stock for $1,000 and sell it a year later for $1,200, I tell my friends I made a $200 profit. But if a bank loans someone $1,000 and the borrower pays back $1,200 a year later, the bank just calls that $200 interest.
Exactly. In both cases, that $200 is simply an annual fee charged for the use of the money. It's rent. You rented out your $1,000 for a year, and the renter paid you $200 for the privilege.
Okay, that makes sense.
But before we get to calculating that rent, there is a massive trap that people fall into when looking at returns, which we can call the principal first rule.
I love this concept because it seems so glaringly obvious when you say it out loud, but it is incredibly easy to get fooled by it on a spreadsheet.
It happens constantly, even to seasoned professionals.
Yeah.
Let's make this tangible. Imagine two different investment scenarios. In both, you hand over $1,000 of your hard-earned cash today.
Okay, $1,000 gone.
Right. Scenario A, 1 year from now, the investment pays out $1,200 and the deal is done.
Easy math. I got my original $1,000 back plus my $200 rent. I made a 20% return. High fives all around.
Exactly. Now look at scenario B. You hand over $1,000 today. At the end of year 1, the investment pays you $200. At the end of year 2, it pays you another $200, and the deal closes.
Okay.
I have seen managers look at that and say, hey, I collected $400. That's a great return over 2 years.
But they're completely ignoring the fact that they never got their massive pile of initial cash back.
Exactly. They're actually sitting on a catastrophic $600 loss.
Wait, they lost $600 and they're celebrating?
Yes. Because they saw positive cash flow coming in, the psychology of receiving a check blinded them to the math. For a return on investment to exist, a complete return of the investment must happen first.
Wow.
A banker won't celebrate collecting interest if the borrower defaults on the $1 million principal. Corporations have to think the exact same way.
So we know that time destroys the value of money, and we know we have to get our principal back before we pop the champagne. How do analysts actually calculate the shrinking value over time? There are specific tools in the discounted cash flow toolkit to handle this, right?
Yes. The primary tool is net present value, or NPV. This is where the heavy lifting happens. NPV takes all those future cash inflows you expect to receive over the next few years, and it shrinks them down to what they're worth today.
Okay.
It does this using a discount rate, which acts like reverse interest.
It's literally a penalty for making the company wait for its money.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right.
Let's say a company wants a 15% return on all its projects. That 15% is their hurdle rate.
Okay.
If a manager pitches a new machine that costs $15,000 today and promises it will generate $6,000 a year for 4 years,
Yeah.
you don't just add up 6,000 4 times and say it makes 24,000.
Well, because of the time value.
Right. You have to shrink each of those future $6,000 chunks by 15% for every year you have to wait for them.
So year one's 6,000 shrinks a little, but year four's 6,000 shrinks a lot because you had to wait 48 months to get it.
Precisely. Once you shrink all those future payments down to today's value, you add them up. In this example, the present value of those inflows is $17,128.
Okay.
You subtract your initial $15,000 investment, and you're left with a net present value of $2,128. Because that number is positive, It means the project clears the 15% hurdle rate and actually generates extra wealth.
Got it. And then you have the profitability index, the PI, which is just a ratio version of the same thing. You divide the present value of the inflows by the outflows.
Right.
If it's over 1.0, you are making money. And the internal rate of return, the IRR, is just the math working backward to tell you the exact percentage you earned. So maybe it's 18% or 22%.
Exactly. But there is a fourth tool that companies use, and it completely ignores all this elegant discounting math. The payback period.
Oh,
That
right.
payback period is fascinating because it is beautifully primitive. It is literally just the amount of time it takes for the raw cash inflows to equal the initial investment.
Okay.
In our machine example, you divide the $15,000 cost by the $6,000 annual return, and you get 2.5 years.
Wait, if it ignores the time value of money and it ignores whatever profits happen in years 3 and 4, why do high-level finance teams even use it? I mean, it sounds kind of useless for finding ROI.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the payback period is not a measure of profitability. It is a measure of liquidity and risk.
Ah, okay.
Think about a company that is struggling to make payroll, or maybe surviving on a very tight line of credit. They cannot afford to wait 5 years for a mathematically perfect NPV to materialize.
Right, they just need cash now.
Exactly. They need to know exactly how many months their cash is going to be held hostage. The payback period tells the CFO exactly when the company can breathe a sigh of relief.
Which brings us to the most human element of all this, which is corporate paranoia.
Yes.
Because understanding risk mathematically naturally leads to understanding risk psychologically. If you pitch a project and the math fails in the real world, like who takes the fall?
This is where corporate investment diverges so sharply from how you and I invest personally.
Mm-hmm.
If I buy a tech stock and it drops, my primary fear is just losing my savings. It hurts, but it's contained.
Right.
In a corporate environment, risk is defined almost entirely as not making the numbers you promised to your superiors.
I want to push back on this, though, because the way corporations handle missing the numbers seems incredibly short-sighted to me.
How so?
Let's say a manager begs for $1 million budget. They promise a massive 20% return on investment. A year goes by, things get complicated, and they only deliver an 8% return. If I made an 8% return on my personal portfolio during a weird economic year, I'd be thrilled. That's still $80,000 of pure profit. But in the corporate world, that manager might get fired. Why is an 8% profit considered a catastrophic failure?
Because you are ignoring the invisible ghost in the room, which is opportunity cost.
Okay.
The corporation's capital is finite. When the executives gave that manager the $1 million, they didn't just say yes to the 20% pitch. They had to say no to 5 other managers who were pitching 12% or 15% projects.
Ah, wow. So by failing to hit the 20% target, it's not just that they underperformed, they actively prevented the company from making more money elsewhere.
They destroyed wealth relative to the alternatives, and that results in a massive loss of credibility. The next time that manager asks for funding, the executives will remember that their promises are hollow.
That makes total sense.
Yeah. And to protect themselves from this exact scenario, corporations utilize a hierarchy of risk using that hurdle rate we discussed. They force riskier projects to clear a much higher bar to even be considered.
Like a high jump competition. The scarier the jump, the bigger the prize money needs to be to convince the athlete to risk breaking their neck.
Exactly. A routine process improvement, like maybe upgrading the accounting software, is low risk. The hurdle rate might only be 15%.
Because you pretty much know it's going to work.
Right. But if you want to build a factory in a totally new international market, the uncertainty skyrockets. The hurdle rate might be set at 21%.
Wow.
And if you're pitching a corporate acquisition, buying a competitor outright, the hurdle rate might jump to 25% or more to justify the sheer chaos of merging 2 companies.
So if you are a manager and your career depends on pitching a project that clears a terrifying 25% hurdle rate without eventually missing the numbers and getting fired, you have to build an ironclad forecast.
You do.
And that requires following the golden rule of incrementality.
Yes, incrementality is the firewall against delusional forecasting. It mandates that you can only include revenues, expenses, and investments that will occur as a direct result of this specific decision. Nothing else.
Give me an example of how a manager might screw that up.
Okay, let's say you are pitching a new line of premium coffee at a cafe chain. You include the cost of the new espresso machines, the new marketing campaign, and the extra barista you have to hire. That is all incremental.
Makes sense.
But an amateur manager might look at the corporate headquarters and say, well, the CEO's salary and the electric bill for the home office is $2 million a year, so I need to allocate a percentage of that overhead to my coffee project's expenses.
But the CEO is getting paid regardless of whether you launch the coffee or not.
Exactly.
The electric bill at headquarters doesn't go up because you added a new latte to the menu. If you include those existing costs, you make your project look artificially unprofitable.
It completely distorts the financial truth of the decision. You have to isolate the specific ripples caused by the stone you were throwing into the pond and ignore the existing waves.
I like that.
But even if a manager manages to build a perfectly incremental forecast, we run into the ultimate limitation: time. How far into the future can any human being realistically predict?
Which brings us to the strict 5-year rule. In corporate finance, with very few exceptions, a forecast should never project cash flows beyond 5 years.
It acts as a necessary leash on human optimism. Global economics and technological advancements move so fast that predicting year 6 or year 7 is practically science fiction.
Yeah.
If a manager pitches a project that doesn't hit his hurdle rate in the first 5 years, but magically shows massive profits in year 8 to make the math work, that is usually analytical manipulation.
Oh, so they just massage the numbers.
Right, they are padding the back end of the timeline with imaginary money just to get the project approved today.
But wait, what if you're building something that physically takes a decade to finish? Like an oil pipeline or a power plant. You can't just pretend years 6 through 20 don't exist.
True. Those are the rare exceptions.
Mm.
Infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, nuclear power. But even when companies are forced to forecast a decade out, history shows us it often ends in disaster.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Think about the energy sector between 2011 and 2014. Oil prices were surging, hovering around $100 a barrel, and occasionally spiking much higher. Companies authorized billions of dollars in deepwater drilling and massive capital expenditures based on 10-year forecasts that assumed oil would stay at $100 forever.
Because it felt like a sure thing at the time, I remember that everyone assumed emerging markets would just consume endless amounts of fuel.
But those spreadsheets couldn't predict the rapid advancement of cheaper fracking technology in the U.S. or the sudden stabilization of oil-producing regions in the Middle East. The market flooded with supply.
Oh.
By 2015, the price of a barrel plummeted below $45. Every single one of those decade-long forecasts was instantly rendered ruinous.
Or look at the Fukushima disaster in 2011. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake and a tsunami caused a nuclear meltdown. Following that, massive multi-decade plans for nuclear expansion globally were halted overnight.
Yep.
You simply cannot put a geopolitical shift or a tectonic earthquake into a present value formula.
You really can't. And managers fall victim to a much quieter trap, too, which is pricing optimism. It is incredibly tempting to assume that as your business grows, you can gradually raise prices to match inflation. But the reality is that competition and technology actively drive prices down over time.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the first flat screen TV you ever bought. It probably cost $3,000 and was like 3 inches thick.
Right.
Today, you can walk into Costco and buy a vastly superior paper-thin TV for $300. If a manufacturer built a factory 10 years ago, assuming they could keep selling TVs for $3,000, their payback period just stretched into infinity.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. When we look at the broader economy to inform these forecasts, the data is staggering. If you survey the top 50 professional economists in the country, the people whose entire lives are dedicated to predictive models, the divergence in their forecasts for GDP, inflation, and unemployment is extreme.
That is the ultimate roast of the forecasting process. These world-class PhD economists routinely fail to accurately predict inflation just 12 months out.
It's true.
If the smartest economist on earth cannot tell you what the economy will look like next year, how on earth can a mid-level manager at a software company guarantee what their product will earn in year 4? It's pure hubris.
Which is why the smartest financial minds advise keeping the horizon short. Assume the current economic environment will remain flat, adjust only for known contracted events in the near future, and cut the forecast off at 5 years.
Okay, so we've explored the time value of money, the paranoia of hurdle rates, the danger of opportunity cost, and the sheer unpredictability of the future. Now we have to apply all of this to The ultimate boss level of corporate finance.
which is corporate acquisitions.
Right. Mergers and acquisitions, M&A, buying an entirely different company.
This is where every single concept we've discussed collides at high speed. Imagine a scenario where a buyer wants to acquire a competitor. Because M&A is the riskiest maneuver in business, their hurdle rate is a punishing 24%.
Brutal.
And because an acquisition is so massive, they are forced to look at a 10-year horizon.
So the seller of the business hands over a shiny, beautifully bound forecast that says, good news, if you buy us, we will generate $9,000 in pure cash flow every single year.
Does the buyer plug that $9,000 into their net present value formula? Absolutely not.
What a way.
The buyer immediately slashes that forecast down to, say, $7,000
Why?
for a concept simply known as seller's optimism.
That is so deeply cynical. But, I mean, it makes perfect sense. The seller is trying to get the highest valuation possible. They're naturally going to paint the rosiest picture of their future.
It is a required layer of cynicism. But then the buyer starts adding their own assumptions. They might add $3,000 a year to the forecast for synergistic benefits.
Meaning value that is unlocked exclusively because the two companies are combining. Like maybe they can cross-sell products to each other's customers.
Exactly. And then they add another $2,000 for improved efficiencies.
Which is corporate speak for, we are going to fire a bunch of redundant HR and accounting staff once we merge.
Precisely. So after stripping away the seller's optimism, adding their own synergistic dreams and accounting for layoffs, the buyer arrives at a newly invented forecast of $12,000 a year. They run that number through the 24% discount rate over 10 years to figure out the maximum price they can pay.
But even with all this rigorous, cynical math, acquisitions fail constantly, usually for three reasons. One, they simply paid too much. Two, those magical synergies and efficiencies proved way harder to implement than expected. Or three, their due diligence was sloppy, and they uncovered a massive lawsuit or broken product line only after they signed the checks.
Right. And if the risk of buying a company is that astronomical, how do buyers protect themselves? How do they ensure the seller isn't just lying about that initial $9,000 forecast, cashing the massive buyout check, and disappearing to a beach?
Let me guess. If the buyer is terrified the seller is lying, do they just hold some of the purchase money hostage until the seller actually proves the business can hit those numbers?
You've just perfectly described an earn-out provision.
Really?
Yeah, it's the ultimate fail-safe in corporate acquisitions. It is a contractual mechanism that ties the final payout directly to the actual real-world achievement of the forecasted cash flows over the next few years.
Oh, that is brilliant. So the buyer says, we agree your company is worth $50 million based on your forecast. Here is $30 million today. You will get the remaining $20 million over the next 3 years if the cash flow actually materializes.
Yeah.
You literally force the seller to put their money where their mouth is.
It neutralizes sellers' optimism instantly. And crucially, it forces the seller's leadership team to stick around and work hard during the messy transition years because their personal payout depends on the merged company succeeding.
So what does this all mean? We have journeyed from the basic concept of irreversible capital expenditures through the time-bending math of discounted cash flow and the absolute necessity of getting your principal back first.
Right.
We've seen how the terrifying fear of opportunity cost drives hurdle rates, the strictness of the 5-year rule to prevent managers from faking the math, and finally, how it all culminates in the intensely cynical protective mechanics of corporate earnouts.
It is a masterclass in trying to exert control over the fundamentally uncontrollable. The mathematics involved, the present value discounting, the compounding formulas, they're flawless. They are objective, immutable laws of finance.
But the human inputs fed into that perfect math are totally flawed. I mean, they are guessing about oil prices, or assuming technology won't change, or pretending they know what inflation will be in year 4.
Which brings us to a final lingering thought. If the mathematical models are flawless, but the human inputs powering them are inherently flawed, heavily biased, and often wildly inaccurate, are corporate financial forecasts actually scientific?
Right.
Or are they just highly sophisticated psychological safety blankets, designed purely to make terrified executives feel comfortable about making massive multi-million-dollar gambles?
It is an incredible paradox to think about, especially when you realize how much of the global economy relies on the illusion of certainty inside those exact spreadsheets. We will leave you with that to ponder.